There are things that people do not say because there is no occasion for them, not because the things are shameful or dangerous or the kind of revelation that alters the architecture of a relationship. Simply because the ordinary rhythms of a shared life, the meals and the school runs and the Sunday mornings and the accumulated texture of two people building something together, do not provide for the kind of conversation in which these things would naturally surface. The truth sits inside a person, not hidden exactly, not burdened exactly, but simply unspoken, waiting perhaps for the right moment, or perhaps not waiting at all, perhaps simply there, the way certain things are simply there until the day they are asked about directly. Miriam Osa had one of these truths. It was not a secret her husband Joseph knew the broad outlines of it, the factual framework. What he did not know, what neither of them had ever sat with in explicit terms, was the full interior of it, what it had required of her, what it had cost, and what it said about the specific quality of the love she had brought to their marriage from its very beginning. He had not known because she had not performed it for him. She was not a woman who performed her own goodness. She simply had it and acted from it and went on. On a Wednesday afternoon in March, on the Family Feud stage, Steve Harvey asked Miriam Osai the kind of question that game shows ask dozens of times per episode, and that almost never produces anything other than a light, easy answer. What he received was something so different in weight and character from what the question was designed to produce that he stood completely still for several seconds. Then, with the deliberate care of a man who understands that he is holding something that should not be dropped, he set his index cards on the podium. He did not pick them up again for 11 minutes. The moment has been described by people who were in the studio that day as one of the quietest things they had ever witnessed on a loud stage. Not quiet because nothing was happening. Quiet because what was happening required everyone in the room to stop and receive it fully. The way you stop when something beautiful and unexpected passes directly in front of you and you understand, instinctively, that the correct response is stillness. Joseph Os, standing at the side of the stage, looked at his wife with an expression that the people nearest him later described as a man seeing something he had always known and never fully seen at the same time. That is a specific kind of moment. It does not come often in a long marriage. When it comes, it matters in ways that persist long after the occasion has passed. Miriam Os was 49 years old and had spent her adult life in the specific, unglamorous work of building things that lasted. She had grown up in Accra, the eldest daughter of a civil servant father and a seamstress mother, and had emigrated to the United States at 22 with a degree in economics, a suitcase, and the particular combination of practical intelligence and personal discipline that her parents had spent 22 years cultivating in her. She had arrived in Atlanta with no contacts and a clear plan, and she had executed the plan with the methodical patience of someone who understands that the distance between where you are and where you intend to be is covered one day at a time. She had worked in banking for 17 years, progressing from a junior analyst position to a senior loans officer role at a regional bank, where she was trusted with decisions that affected the financial trajectories of families and small businesses throughout the Atlanta metropolitan area. She was known at her institution for two things: her accuracy and her honesty. She did not tell applicants what they wanted to hear. She told them what was true, explained it in terms they could understand, and helped them make the best available decision rather than the most convenient one. She had turned down loans that other officers might have approved, and she had approved loans that other officers might have turned down, and her track record on both sides of those decisions was among the strongest in the branch. She was, outside of work, a woman of few words and considerable effect, the kind of person who, when she spoke in a group, the group listened, because experience had taught the people around her that Miriam Osai's words were chosen carefully and worth receiving carefully. Her children knew this. Her colleagues knew this. Joseph knew this, and had known it since the first week of their marriage 23 years earlier, and had never stopped being grateful for it. What Joseph did not know, what he had not known for 23 years, not because it had been concealed from him, but because the question had never been asked in quite the right way, was the full story of the year before their wedding. The year in which Miriam, newly arrived in Atlanta, employed but not yet stable, had encountered a particular set of circumstances and had made a particular set of choices that said everything about who she was and that she had simply never narrated to him in their complete form. The story was not dramatic. It did not contain any element that would have surprised Joseph about his wife's character, because the character it revealed was exactly the character he had been living beside for 23 years. What it contained was the specific, detailed evidence of something he had taken on faith. And faith confirmed by evidence is a different and more complete thing than faith alone. Joseph Osai was 52 years old and had the quality, increasingly rare and increasingly valuable in the world he moved through, of being a man who meant what he said. He had grown up in Kumasi, the second of three sons of a teacher and a pharmacist, and had come to the United States at 25 for a graduate degree in civil engineering, and had stayed, not because the plan had always been to stay, but because Atlanta had offered him work that mattered and a woman he was not prepared to leave. He had built a career as a structural engineer with a firm that specialized in infrastructure projects, bridges, public buildings, the kind of work whose value is measured in decades and whose failures are visible to everyone. He was good at it. He had the engineer's preference for things that were true and the engineer's impatience with things that were not, and both qualities had served him in his professional life and in his marriage with equal reliability. He loved Miriam with the specific quality of love that develops when a person marries someone who is genuinely their equal, not in every dimension, but in the dimension that matters most, which is the dimension of character. He trusted her judgment completely. He found her after 23 years still interesting, which is not a small thing in a long marriage and which he did not take for granted. He had told her this periodically, in the direct way he told her things, and she had received it in the equally direct way she received things. And between them this had constituted the emotional vocabulary of a marriage that was real and solid and built on the right materials. He had no reason to believe he did not know his wife fully. He knew her as well as any person can know another person across 23 years of shared life. What he discovered on a Wednesday afternoon in March was that the knowing he had was accurate as far as it went, and that it did not go quite far enough, not because she had withheld, but because the full story requires the right occasion to emerge, and the occasion had simply not come until now. The Osai family team was 5. Joseph and Miriam, their daughter Abina, who was 24 and had her father's directness and her mother's composure in a combination that made her precise and occasionally alarming in conversation. Their son Kweku, who was 21 and was in his junior year of university studying architecture. And Miriam's younger sister Efua, who was 45 and had known Miriam for her entire life, and was the one person on earth who knew the full story of the year before the wedding. Because she had been living with Miriam in Atlanta when it happened and had watched it unfold. Efua had accepted the Family Feud invitation with the quiet certainty of a woman who had been carrying a piece of her sister's story for 23 years and had a sense, not a plan, not a scheme, simply a sense, that today was the day it would find its way into the room where it had always belonged. She had not said this to Miriam. She had not needed to. Miriam had looked at her across the kitchen table in Atlanta. The morning they left for Lowe's Angels, and Efua had held her gaze for a moment, and Miriam had nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and that had been the entire conversation. The day before the taping had the quality of good days spent in anticipation of something, a brightness to the ordinary pleasures, a presence in the conversations, the specific warmth of a family that had been going well for long enough to know what going well felt like and to appreciate it consciously. Joseph photographed the city with the attentive pleasure of an engineer who finds architecture everywhere. Kweku and Abina argued good-naturedly about a film they had both seen and interpreted completely differently, which was entirely in character for both of them. Miriam watched her family move through a new city and felt, as she sometimes did in these moments of collective ease, the particular gratitude of a person who built carefully and has arrived somewhere worth having arrived. The Family Feud studio received the Osai family with the organized warmth it brought to every taping, and the Osai family received it in return with the particular quality they brought to new environments: attentive, engaged, not easily overwhelmed. Joseph moved through the pre-taping process with the calm efficiency of a man who has spent a career in rooms where precision matters and has learned to bring his full attention to whatever is immediately in front of him. Miriam was present in the specific way she was always present, fully, without performance, in a way that made people feel genuinely engaged with rather than socially processed. Abina observed everything with the compressed attentiveness of a young woman assembling a picture before committing to a response. Kweku was easy and open, talking to the production staff with the natural curiosity of someone for whom new rooms are primarily interesting. Efua stood close to Miriam and said nothing in particular and noticed everything, which had been her practice in every room she had shared with her sister for 45 years. Steve Harvey came out and worked the room with the full ease of his considerable professional gift. And when he reached the Osai family, he moved through the introductions with the genuine, specific curiosity that distinguished his hosting from the merely competent version of it. He found Joseph immediately interesting and spent a moment on the infrastructure work, the bridges, the public buildings, the years-long commitment to structures that outlast the people who built them, with the attention of a man who respects people who build things that last. He was charmed by Abina's precision and told her so, which she received without embarrassment and without false modesty, both of which he appreciated. He lingered a moment with Efua, who gave him the particular energy of a person in possession of something they intend to let surface at the right moment. Then he reached Miriam. "Miriam Osai," he said. He looked at her with the attentiveness he brought to people who interested him from the first moment. "Tell me who you are." "I am a loans officer," she said. 17 years in banking. 17 years deciding who gets the money and who doesn't," Steve said. "Deciding," she said, "who is ready for the commitment the money requires. It is not the same thing." Steve Harvey held her gaze for a moment. He had the expression he wore when a person had just revealed in a single sentence the specific quality of the way they thought. "No," he said, "it is not the same thing at all." He glanced at Joseph, who was nodding with the quiet pride of a man who has heard his wife say something precisely true and is not surprised by it. Then back to Miriam. "I think you are going to be very good at this. I intend to answer the questions accurately," she said. Steve Harvey smiled in the way he smiled when someone had said something that he was going to remember. He moved on to the game. Efua, standing 3 feet away, looked at the ceiling briefly and returned her gaze to the stage. The Osai family was matched against the Hernandez family from Houston, a 5-person team of considerable collective energy anchored by a 60-year-old grandmother named Rosario, who had the competitive instinct of a woman who had spent her life running a household of 6 children and found the transition to game show contestant entirely natural. The match was lively and close throughout. Joseph played with the considered precision of an engineer working through a problem, not fast, but accurate, identifying the correct answer and delivering it without unnecessary decoration. He hit 2 top answers in the first 2 rounds that established the Osai's lead. Abina was sharp and economical, contributing cleanly when the opportunity arrived. Kweku had the instinct of someone who trusts his first thought, which was correct approximately 2/3 of the time and spectacularly incorrect the remaining third, in a way that the audience found proportionally entertaining. Efua, given the podium in the 3rd round on a question about things a woman keeps from her husband, answered with good news, and then added before Steve Harvey could respond, until the right time. The board gave her the top answer at 43 points. Steve Harvey looked at her for a long moment. Efua received the look without visible discomfort. Something passed between them that the audience registered without being able to name. Miriam won the main game for them. In the 5th round, with the Osais needing specific answers to hold their lead, she stepped to the podium and named the top answers on 2 consecutive questions with the clean efficiency of a woman who had spent 17 years reading situations accurately and knew what the right answer was before the decoration had been applied to it. The Osais won by 37 points. The celebration was warm and genuine. Joseph held Miriam briefly with the particular quality of his affection, present, unhurried, complete. The children piled in. Efua stood at the edge of the group and watched her sister's family celebrate and wore the expression of a woman who has been keeping faith with something for a long time and is about to be released from it. Steve brought the family to center stage. 2 players, 5 questions each, 200 points to win $20,000. The Osai's discussion was brief and arrived at its conclusion by simple logic. Miriam and Joseph. Miriam first, Joseph to close. Nobody proposed an alternative and nobody needed to. Their children recognized it as the obvious answer and the family moved accordingly. As the family moved toward the backstage area, Efua paused beside Miriam for a moment. She did not say anything. She simply looked at her sister with the specific expression of a woman who has been waiting 45 years to witness something and is ready. Miriam looked back at her. Then Miriam walked to the podium. Steve Harvey positioned himself across from her. He looked at the woman opposite him, this particular woman with her particular quality of contained, directed attention, and asked if she was ready. "Yes," Miriam said. "Then let us begin." Miriam answered the first 4 fast money questions with the clean, organized precision that had characterized her main game performance. Steve asked her to name something a wife does better than she lets on. She said, "Manages everything." The top answer, 41 points. He asked her to name a quality that makes a marriage last. She said, choosing it daily. Number 2 answer, 29 points. And the room received that one in the slightly fuller way it receives answers that are true in more than their survey dimension. He asked her to name something a woman never forgets. She said, who was there when it was hard? Number 1 answer, 44 points. The 4th question, name something a wife gave up that she never told her husband about. Miriam was quiet for 2 seconds. Then she said, an easier life. Number 2 answer, 26 points. 140 points after 4 questions. The room had moved from the bright, warm engagement of a well-run game show into something with a slightly different temperature, not colder but denser, more considered. The kind of attention a room gives when it has picked up a signal it cannot quite identify and is paying close attention to what comes next. Steve Harvey was looking at Miriam with the expression he wore when the game had become something other than the game. He asked the 5th question. All right, Miriam, last one. Name the moment a wife knew she had married the right man. The question was designed for warmth, the first dance, the crisis handled, the small, tender gesture at an unexpected moment. Any of a dozen answers that would score well and keep the energy of the afternoon bright. Miriam did not give any of those answers. She looked at the question. She looked at Steve Harvey. And then not as a performance, not as a calculation, but in the simple, direct way she did everything, she said. When I was sick, the year before we were married, I had no insurance. I was new to this country. I had a serious diagnosis and no money and no family nearby, and I did not tell Joseph because we were not yet married and I did not want him to stay with me out of obligation. I handled it alone for 4 months. And then I got better and we got married and I never told him. But the moment I knew I had married the right man was not during those 4 months. It was every day of the 23 years since. Because a man who would have stayed if he had known and he would have stayed, I understood this later, is worth more than a man who stayed because he had to. I married the man who would have stayed. Steve Harvey did not move. The studio was completely silent. Not the held-breath silence of an audience waiting for what comes next, the deeper silence of a room that has just received something that has changed the quality of the air in it. 200 people breathing, none of them speaking, all of them still. Steve Harvey looked at Miriam for a long moment. Then he looked at the index cards in his hand. He set them on the podium. He did not pick them up again. The board turned. The survey answer appeared. When he showed up was always there, number 1 answer. 43 points. 183 points. Nobody in the room was counting points. The silence held for a full 15 seconds after the board turned. Steve Harvey stood at the podium with his cards set aside and both hands resting on the surface, and looked at Miriam with an expression that contained no performance whatsoever. Just a man encountering something that had reached him all the way through and taking the time to be reached. Then he turned to look toward the backstage area, toward where Joseph was watching his wife's round on a monitor, and he turned back to Miriam, and he spoke in the quiet, level voice he used when he was not managing a room but simply talking to a person. Miriam, he said, I need to understand what you just told me. You were sick, seriously sick, the year before your wedding. You had no support. You handled it alone, and you did not tell Joseph. That is correct, she said. Because you did not want him to stay out of obligation. Yes. So you protected him and yourself from a version of the marriage that was not freely chosen. Miriam was quiet for a moment. I protected the marriage, she said. I wanted us to begin from a place where both people had chosen freely. If he had stayed because I was ill, I would never have known whether he had stayed because he wanted to. This way I know. Steve Harvey stood with this for a long moment. Around him, the room was still completely quiet, the particular quiet of 200 people thinking rather than reacting, which is the rarest and most complete form of audience attention. 23 years, he said finally. You have known this for 23 years, and he has not. He has known I was ill, Miriam said. I told him after we were married. What he does not know is that I was ill before the wedding, and that I chose not to tell him. Steve Harvey turned to the production team and made the gesture that everyone on the crew recognized as the one that meant. Bring the family out, all of them. Now. Joseph Ose walked out from the backstage area with the bearing of a man who had been watching his wife's fast money round on a monitor and had heard something that was reorganizing, quietly and completely, his understanding of the woman he had been married to for 23 years. He walked to the center of the stage. He looked at Miriam. Miriam looked back at him with the composed, open expression she always wore, the expression that was not a performance of composure but simply the natural state of a woman who had made her peace with what she was carrying long before she set it down. Steve Harvey stood between them and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, gently, Joseph, your wife just told this room something she has been carrying for 23 years of your marriage. I'm going to let you have a moment with it. Take what you need. Joseph was quiet for a long time. His eyes were bright. He He was doing the thing that people do when they are receiving information that is too large to process quickly and have enough self-possession not to pretend otherwise. He was simply standing there with the full weight of it and breathing. Then he said in a voice that was very quiet and very certain, "You were sick." "Yes," Miriam said, "before the wedding." "Yes, and you handled it alone because you did not want me to stay for the wrong reason." "Yes." He looked at her for a long time. Something was moving across his face that was too complex to name in any single word. It was grief for a version of that year he had not been present for. And it was the specific, expanding love of a man who has just been given precise evidence of something he had only previously understood in general terms. And it was the particular emotion that arrives when you understand that the person you chose you back. Not passively, not by default, but actively at considerable cost to themselves. In a way that protected the integrity of the choosing. He had no word for all of that at once. He did not need one. He said, "I would have stayed." "I know," Miriam said. "That is the point." Steve Harvey put his hand on his chest and turned to the audience, and the audience was already standing. Not gradually, all at once, the way rooms stand when something has arrived that cannot be received sitting down. Steve Harvey turned back to the room and spoke with the directness and the personal authority that he reserved for things he understood from the inside. "I want to say something," he said, "because what this woman just did deserves to be named correctly. Miriam Osai, alone in a new country, with no support and no insurance and a serious medical situation, made a decision that most people would not have the clarity or the courage to make. She decided that she would rather face the most frightening year of her young life entirely alone than introduce into her marriage, before it had even begun, an obligation that would make it impossible to know whether her husband's love was freely given." He paused. "Think about what that requires. Think about what it costs." She was 26 years old in a country that was not yet fully hers, facing something that was genuinely frightening, and she was alone in it. Not because she had no one who would have come. Joseph would have come. She knew it then, and she confirmed it tonight. But because she valued the freedom of his choice more than she valued his presence in that moment. Because she wanted a marriage built on the real thing, not on the version of care that arrives when a person has no other option. He looked at Joseph. And this man, who did not know, who could not have known, has spent 23 years loving a woman whose love for him was this specific, this deliberate, this costly. He has been living inside a marriage that was built on an act of protection he never knew was made. And now he knows. He paused. "Joseph, your wife chose you. She chose you freely under conditions that were harder than you knew. That is the most complete version of being chosen that I can imagine." The room was still standing. Several people in the front rows were no longer managing their responses with any visible success. Abina, at the side of the stage, had her hand over her mouth. Kweku stood very still beside her. Efua stood apart with her hands clasped and her eyes closed for a moment, in the attitude of a woman releasing something she has held for a very long time. Joseph walked to his wife. He did not say anything. He put his arms around her and held her, and she held him, and the room gave them the silence that the moment required. Not the silence of an audience waiting for what comes next, but the silence of a room that understands it is witnessing something complete. Joseph needed 17 points. He stepped to the fast money podium with the settled attention of a man who has just received something enormous and has placed it carefully to one side in order to do what the situation requires, because that is what structural engineers do. They hold large things and keep working. He answered all 5 questions. He scored 58 points. The Osai family finished with 241. The board illuminated, and the studio responded with the warm, sustained applause of a room that had been through something real and was glad to have been in it. The celebration was quiet by the standards of the show, not subdued, but full in a way that did not require volume. Abina held her mother. Kweku held his father. Efua hugged Miriam last and held on without saying anything, and 23 years of a kept faith passed between them in the holding, and then she let go. The Osai family had dinner that evening at a restaurant near their hotel, and afterward Joseph and Miriam walked along the waterfront for an hour, while their children went back ahead of them. What they said to each other during that walk has not been shared publicly, and the privacy of it should be respected for exactly the reason that Miriam had described on the stage. Some things have their full meaning only when they are between the two people they belong to. What Miriam has confirmed in the single interview she gave 14 months after the broadcast is that Joseph asked her to tell him the full story of that year, not the outline, not the medical summary, but the interior of it. What the days had felt like, what the decisions had required, what it had been like to carry it and continue. She had told him. It had taken 2 evenings and part of a third morning to tell fully, and he had listened to all of it with the complete, unhurried attention that was his particular gift, and had asked questions that told her he was receiving it rather than simply hearing it. She said the experience of telling it, after 23 years of carrying it as the one unshared room in an otherwise fully shared life, had felt like opening a door she had locked so long ago that she had nearly forgotten the door was there. She said he had cried once, briefly, during the second evening's telling. She had not expected that. She had understood it when it came. It was the grief of a person who has just learned that someone they love was alone in something difficult and wishes with the full force of retrospective love that they could have been there. She had told him that she had not been alone in the deepest sense. She had been alone in the room, but she had known, in the way you know things about the people you have chosen carefully, that he would have come if she had called. That knowing had been its own form of company. He had received that, and they had gone on. The episode aired on a Thursday evening 8 weeks after the taping. The clip of Miriam's fifth answer circulated within the first 2 hours and had reached 12 million views before midnight. Within 48 hours, the number was at 40 million. By the end of the week, 70 million. By the end of the month, the clip had been shared across platforms the show did not typically reach, in languages it did not typically appear in, to audiences that had no prior connection to Family Feud, and found the clip through the specific mechanism by which true things spread, one person sending it to another with the message that they needed to see this. The quality of the response was unlike anything the show had produced in its recent history. It was not the viral spread of something entertaining, though the clip was that. It was the spread of something that had reached people in a register that entertainment does not typically access, the register of genuine recognition, of being shown something about love and cost and chosen commitment that they had not previously seen stated in these terms. Women wrote about the specific quality of Miriam's reasoning, the decision to protect the freedom of Joseph's choice even at considerable cost to herself, as the most precise articulation of a kind of love they recognized and had never found the language for. Men wrote about what it meant to understand that you had been chosen this deliberately, that the person beside you had made a decision of this caliber before you even knew a decision was being made. Steve Harvey's framing, "She valued the freedom of his choice more than she valued his presence in that moment," was extracted and shared independently of the full clip as one of the most precise formulations of a concept that most people carry as an instinct without the analytical language to articulate it. It appeared in wedding speeches. It appeared in the professional literature of people who study commitment and long-term partnership. It appeared in the personal correspondence of people who had watched the clip and immediately needed to send it to someone specific with no explanation attached, because the explanation was contained in the clip and was sufficient. The reason Miriam Osai's answer has persisted, has been watched and shared and discussed for years rather than weeks, is that it named something about the architecture of genuine commitment that is rarely named in public. Most conversations about love focus on what it gives: the presence, the support, the warmth, the accumulated comfort of being known and cared for across a long life. Fewer conversations address what love sometimes requires a person to withhold, not deceitfully, but deliberately, in service of something they value more than the immediate comfort of being fully known. Miriam had valued the integrity of Joseph's choice more than she had valued the relief of telling him. That is a more demanding form of love than the kind that simply asks to be received. It requires a person to think not just about what they need in a given moment, but about what the relationship needs across the long arc of the life being built, and to act in service of the arc rather than the moment, even when the moment is genuinely difficult. Most people understand this in the abstract. Very few people demonstrate it in the specific way that Miriam Osai demonstrated it in the year before her wedding, in a country that was not yet fully hers, alone in something that was genuinely frightening, holding the integrity of a marriage she had not yet formally entered. What Steve Harvey named correctly was not merely that this was an act of love. It was that it was an act of respect for Joseph's autonomy, for the quality of his choosing, for the kind of marriage she intended to build and would not compromise before it had even begun. These are different things, love and respect, and the best marriages contain both, and the marriages that contain both in this specific and deliberate form are the ones that the people in them describe, years later, as having been built on the right materials. Abina wrote to her mother 2 days after the broadcast. The message was long and careful in the way of a young woman who processes through language and takes the time to find the right words before sending them. She said that watching the clip, watching it again after the taping, with the distance that screen provides, had reorganized something in her understanding of her own parents. She had grown up inside a marriage that she had always perceived as strong, and she had understood the strength as a product of her parents' characters individually. She now understood it as a product of something more specific, of choices made before the marriage had formally begun, choices made in conditions of genuine difficulty that had established the foundation on which everything since had been built. She said, "I have been trying to understand what it means to choose someone correctly. I think I understand it better now. It means choosing the integrity of the relationship over your own immediate comfort. You did that. I am carrying it." Kweku processed it in the way he processed most things, slowly, practically, in the form of changed behavior rather than articulated reflection. He called his father 3 weeks after the broadcast and asked him questions about the year before the wedding that he had never thought to ask before, what Joseph had known, what he had not known, what it had been like to receive the information on the stage. Joseph had told him, fully and without abbreviation, including the grief of the second evening's telling and the specific quality of what it had meant to understand in his 50s, that the woman he had married had protected the freedom of his choice at the cost of her own comfort. Kweku was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I want to be the kind of person someone would make that choice for," Joseph had said. "Then be worth choosing. The rest follows." The $20,000 from Family Feud was divided in a conversation that began with Joseph saying, "I would like to use some of this to go back to the beginning." He meant Ghana, Accra, and Kumasi, the cities they had each come from, which neither of them had visited in several years, and which both of them had been carrying as a kind of root knowledge through the decades of building a life in Atlanta. They went the following autumn, all 5 of them, for 3 weeks. Miriam showed Joseph the neighborhood in Accra where she had grown up, the secondary school she had attended, the market where her mother had sold cloth on Saturdays, the places that had produced the person he had met in Atlanta at a point when her formation was complete, but her history in this country had not yet begun. He walked through them with the attentiveness he brought to everything structural, noting how things were built, what had lasted, what the materials said about the intentions of the people who had placed them. He said on the 3rd evening in Accra that he understood his wife better for having seen where she came from. She said she had known he would. A portion of the money went toward Abina's first year of independent housing, a contribution made by both parents, offered jointly, with the specific message that starting well matters and that the cost of a good start is something a family bears together. Abina accepted it with the composed directness she brought to everything and said, "I will try to deserve it." Joseph said, "You already do. This is not about deserving. It is about beginning correctly." Miriam said nothing. She did not need to. The remainder was put toward the house, specifically toward a renovation of the room that had been Kweku's bedroom, and that was now, with both children launched into their own lives, available to become something else. Miriam turned it into a study. It has a desk that faces a window looking out over the garden, which Joseph planted in the spring and which has come in well, and a shelf of books organized with the methodical precision of a woman who knows where everything is and why it is there. She works in it on weekend mornings before the rest of the house is awake, in the specific quiet of early mornings that belong only to the person who rises to meet them. Joseph brings her coffee. He does not knock. He sets it on the corner of the desk and does not interrupt what she is doing, and she acknowledges it without looking up, and he goes back downstairs, and this exchange, small, habitual, precise, is the clearest possible expression of 23 years of a marriage built the right way, with full attention without performance, on the understanding that the person beside you chose you deliberately and deserves to be treated as someone whose choosing was worth the cost. It was worth the cost. That is the whole story. Miriam Osei knew it before she walked onto a game show stage in March. The rest of the world found out on a Thursday evening 8 weeks later. Joseph found out in the moment that his wife looked at Steve Harvey and simply answered the question she was asked. She intended to answer accurately. She always had. If Miriam's story reached you, if it named something about love and cost, and choosing correctly that you have been carrying without language for it, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. These are the stories worth keeping. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one.